The Washington Post runs an occasional column called 10 Questions For, and they interview a public official in Washington, D.C., and ask them things like from their favorite rock group to, you know, the Sublime. But it was interesting to me, I read the column that Al Kamen did called In the Loop, where he asked Secretary Moniz 10 questions in terms of life in D.C. And the last question he was asked was, you can draft one person in the private sector to come and work for the federal government. Who would it be, and what would you have them do? And mentally, when I was scanning this, I was prepared for the answer that the Secretary of Energy would give, but I was blown away by what he said. He said it takes a team, and I'd seek business, military, and religious leaders, very interesting, who would work together to promote the economic, security, and environmental imperatives for dealing with climate change. And again, to have one of the leading voices combating climate change in this administration to affirm in the Washington Post, in this sort of 10-question quiz that they give them, to affirm the vital role of religious leaders in working with the government to mitigate climate change, I think is an indicator of his own passion and his really firm grasp on the role that your communities have to have if we're going to successfully address this. Likewise, yesterday we spent a fair amount of time talking about Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. I discovered that Secretary Moniz issued a press release upon reading the papal encyclical. And I just want to take a moment and read that to you. Again, not the usual sort of thing you would expect from the Secretary of Energy of the United States. The Secretary wrote, Pope Francis's call to action on climate change is an important milestone on the global effort on this issue. He is not just a powerful moral voice, he also graduated as a chemical engineer and understands the consensus of climate scientists that accumulating man-made pollution endangers our planet and people around the world. As Pope Francis reminds us, we must push for ambitious and cost-effective solutions that protect us all, including the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Pope Francis should inspire all countries to redouble the deployment of clean energy technologies and energy efficiencies and find the international will to significantly cut global emissions of heat-trapping pollution. I thank Pope Francis for his leadership and encourage people of all faiths to work toward the common goal of a safer world achieved by universal access to clean and affordable energy. Again, I think an astonishingly positive statement on the part of the Secretary. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and read the Secretary's official biography, and then I will introduce him when he arrives, and I hope we can welcome him with the appropriate applause when he comes in. So as United States Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz is tasked with implementing critical Department of Energy missions in support of President Obama's goals of growing the economy, enhancing security, and protecting the environment. This encompasses advancing the President's all-of-the-above energy strategy, maintaining the nuclear deterrent and reducing the nuclear danger, promoting American leadership in science and clean energy technology innovation, cleaning up the legacy of the Cold War, and strengthening management and performance. Prior to his appointment, Dr. Moniz was the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was a faculty member since 1973. At MIT, he headed the Department of Physics and the Bates Linear Accelerator Center. Most recently, Dr. Moniz served as the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative and as director of the MIT Laboratory for Energy and the Environment, where he was a leader of a multidisciplinary technology and policy studies on the future of nuclear power, coal, nuclear fuel cycles, natural gas, and solar energy in a low-carbon world. From 1997 until 2001, Dr. Moniz served as the Undersecretary of the Department of Energy. He was responsible for overseeing the department's science and technology programs, leading a comprehensive review of nuclear weapons stockpile stewardship, and serving as the Secretary's special negotiator for the disposition of Russian nuclear materials. From 1995 to 1997, he served as Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President. In addition to his work at MIT, the White House, and the Department of Energy, Dr. Moniz has served on a number of boards of directors and commissions involving science, energy, and security. These include President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the Department of Defense Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, and the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. As a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Moniz is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Humboldt Foundation, and the American Physical Society. Dr. Moniz received a Bachelor of Science degree summa cum laude in physics from Boston College, a doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University, and honorary degrees from the University of Athens, the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Michigan State University, and the Universidad Pontificia de Comillas. So we are anticipating his arrival shortly. So I'm pleased to introduce the United States Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. Please stand and let's give him a warm welcome to the State Department.
Well, thank you all, and my apologies for being a bit late, but sometimes these international phone calls cannot be scheduled too precisely. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and actually some of you are familiar from a meeting we had last October at the Department of Energy with faith leaders, and I mentioned at that time that in 2004 I was a signatory to a letter written by about 30 scientists and faith leaders. In fact, it was titled a plea from religion and science for action on global climate change. And I guess I just want to reinforce that I thought that this dialogue was important then. It is certainly no less important now. And so I'm really pleased to kind of reinforce that. As far as the science part of that equation goes, I'm going to draw upon an interesting history of climate science and public policy that was assembled by John Holdren, the President's science advisor, and I believe it's posted on the OSTP website. You might be interested. I guess I had forgotten that this is a 50th anniversary year. The 50th anniversary of the first report to the President on the risks of climate change. It was a 1965, what is now PCAST, but it was then called PSAC, President's Science Advisory Committee to President Johnson. And it talked about advances in climate science, and it also talked a little bit about kind of contrarian counterpoints, but made a very strong plea about the need for us to address that. In fact, the PSAC task force that made that report was chaired by Roger Revelle, a well-known name in this business. But I think some of that history, it might be interesting just to say a few high points. It actually goes back to 1824, so we are approaching the 2-century mark when Joseph Fourier, a very famous name in mathematics, said that the Earth's surface would be colder in the absence of an atmosphere, and that was the beginning of the greenhouse effect. But then some years later, I'll skip to 1896, when Arrhenius actually did a quantitative estimate of the doubling of the impact of a doubling of CO2 and came out with a surface temperature increase of about 5 degrees centigrade. Now that was a very straightforward so-called linear calculation, but it's not that far off, frankly, from what we have in terms of now much more complex models, et cetera. So again, it's just to reinforce, I think in this audience it's kind of well known that this is not exactly some surprising new phenomenon, but something that's been known for a long time. But as you also know, I think many of you know at least that Arrhenius did this calculation, but felt that there was no real problem for the order of a millennium, not anticipating the economic increase and the use of fossil fuel increase that shrunk the millennium scale to a century scale fundamentally, and that's what we are, of course, dealing with. In fact, in 1957, then a National Academy of Science report talked about our consuming our fossil fuels at a prodigious rate. Our civilization, I'm just quoting, our civilization is conducting a grandiose scientific experiment, and unfortunately that remains a very apt description of what we are doing. Now, I'll be coming to what we hope will be the solution to this. And even though I'm a physicist, I just as soon not do the experiment. My curiosity is limited in this case. Then, in this history, in 1979, a fellow MIT professor, Charney, kind of led the way in terms of applying these big general circulation models of the atmosphere, and concluded, going back to Arrhenius, that the temperature rise from doubling CO2 concentrations would be 3 plus or minus 1.5 degrees centigrade. So again, very close to this. But I think that's important in the context of the so-called attempts of deniers, in the sense that it is a very straightforward calculation, going back to the one of the 19th century. It's a very straightforward calculation about not only the effect, but the scale of the effect. And there has been no credible assertion as to what would reverse that. So I just want to kind of very clear that we are on extremely solid ground, certainly for the issue of the need for a response. I mean, it defies belief, frankly, that one would argue that a strong response is not called for. That report, the Charney report, also warned, and again, technically it's because of the large heat capacity of the ocean, et cetera, that the atmosphere takes decades to come to equilibrium with any given CO2 concentration. And so that's, again, this idea that, like it or not, we're at 0.9 degrees centigrade now, and we have cooked in additional temperature rises. So this also leads to the urgency of our really addressing this issue now. Of course, in the history, then, a big milestone also was the 1988 Jim Hansen testimony in Congress, and making it clear that the anthropogenic warming was becoming evident, and how continuation would lead to extreme weather, floods, heat waves, et cetera, all the various discussions that we have concerning both mitigation and adaptation. Then in this selective history, in 1997, now PCAST for the Clinton administration really focused on the idea of solutions, and how solutions would really focus not exclusively, but primarily on the question of clean energy technology. That ultimately that was the solution, obviously, for minimizing CO2 emissions, and that's going to come to the theme that I will be talking about today. With one more stop on this selective history, which is 2010, another PCAST report now for President Obama on the accelerating pace of change in energy technologies. And a quote from that report is, the best science suggests that dramatic reductions in CO2 emissions need to start this decade in the industrialized world, and with little delay in the emerging economies as well, to mitigate the risk of major consequences. I think that's particularly a powerful statement because I co-chair the committee of PCAST that wrote that report, and so it must be something that I believe in. But that brings us to the place where, just to summarize again the understandings underpinning now our action plan, the President's action plan, just as a concise summary. First, the Earth's climate is changing at a pace and in a pattern that is not explainable by natural influences. Second, the dominant cause of the changes is an increase in the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, as well as black carbon caused primarily by fossil fuel burning and land use change. Third, with global temperature about 0.9 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial, these changes are already causing significant harm to life, health, property, economies, and ecosystems. Fourth, the harm will continue to grow for decades in the case of sea level rise, centuries because of long atmosphere to ocean and even longer atmosphere ocean ice equilibrium times, and because of inertia in society's energy system and land use practices. Fifth, the amount of future harm to be expected will be much smaller if we take prompt, strong, evasive action than if we don't. And sixth, the cost of the needed evasive action is very likely to be much smaller than the cost to society from future change in the absence of the needed action. And this is true even without counting the co-benefits of both mitigation and adaptation measures. So that's kind of a very quick two-century scale, but I wanted to go over that to emphasize, first of all, what really is the scientific case, but what is also the structure of the solutions now that we are advancing, and I'm going to elaborate that in terms of the way we are approaching Paris. So, as I said, a year ago, some of us here met at DOE, and since that year, there have been some very important developments. I would say that, at least personally, in that meeting last October, one might have had some skepticism about the potential for major steps in Paris. I think that we are in a much more positive frame of mind, shall we say, and I would say that the President Obama, President Xi announcement in November in Beijing was really, I think, the starting point of a changed conversation, and that changed conversation has been sustained because both countries, since that announcement, have shown important commitments to national programs to pursue the targets that we have set forward. I mean, a clear example, the United States, obviously, is the Clean Power Plan to address emissions from power plants, and in the Chinese case, the recent announcement in September here in the United States by President Xi in terms of implementing a cap-and-trade system. So, you know, I'm not saying I want to be Pollyannish in terms of this, but I think it's very important that I think China and the United States have both shown a commitment in their national programs to put forward some strong measures, and that has changed really, again, the conversation. I think it would have been hard to imagine last October, 152 at my last look, INDCs from across the world, from countries industrialized to developing, north, south, you name it, so I at least feel that Paris will lead to meaningful steps forward without being, again, overly Pollyannish, in the sense that we've all seen the analyses that the INDCs, while I would call them collectively a fairly ambitious set of INDCs in the current realities, they are not sufficient to reach the goals that the science that we've just touched on earlier tells us that we need to do, namely the 2 degree centigrade target. However, I want to make 2 perhaps more optimistic statements about that set of INDCs. Number one, we should always remember that we say 2 degrees centigrade, but we should remember that what we're talking about is trying to stabilize at certain CO2 or greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and that the relationship between any particular concentration and, let's say, the average temperature rise is probabilistic, right? So if we do 450, it's probably 2 degrees, but we should remember these are distributions. And what's very important and not emphasized enough, sometimes some express that, well, we're not really going to reach this, and so, well, I mean, sometimes it's like, why should we try so hard? Well, the reality is, even with today's set of INDCs, perhaps it's closer to 3 degrees centigrade than 2 degrees centigrade, if that's what there is. But in that probability distribution, that makes a very, very big difference in the probability of a much higher temperature rise. It really eliminates what we would call the tails of the distribution, and that is very important in terms of stability of our Earth system. So that's one point, that if that was all there was, it would still be a major step forward in terms of lowering our risk of very catastrophic consequences. But we want to do better, and a key here will be how we come out of Paris, not only with those INDCs committed to, but with a mechanism for periodic, and hopefully the period isn't too long, periodic review of those INDCs, of those targets, so that the hope will be that in fact we will have significantly increased ambition with time, so that we can in fact get to the kinds of levels of concentrations that we all hope for. So what does that mean? It means that certainly I can speak for the Department of Energy, but I think this represents a broader administration view that we are taking to Paris a very strong focus on the clean energy technology innovation agenda. That is going to be a major theme that we will put forward all the way up to the level of leaders, including our leader, President Obama. This is going to be a very important agenda to Paris. It's going to be a very important agenda item from Paris as we set the conditions for meeting the INDCs, but for also getting that greater ambition as time goes on. Why is that? It's pretty simple. The energy technology innovation agenda, when all is said and done, some of my entrepreneurial friends don't like to hear it phrased this way, but when all is said and done, the goal is cost reduction. It's continuing to drive down the costs of clean energy technology going forward. And that, for obvious reasons, that cost reduction is key to increased ambition in the future. If we can get the cost down, then that will permit not simply industrialized, but also emerging economies, developing economies, to tackle this question of cost reduction. Secondly, cost reduction, almost by definition, is what we need if we are going to bring along the poor, the underserved in the global community. And as you know, that is a large number, and the prospects of getting that number down, we could say a couple of billion people, certainly in terms of no or insufficient energy services, is something that I think certainly this community here understands is something that we cannot, we really cannot, we should not, we cannot accept. So again, I think this This innovation agenda is something that we think is really critical in multiple dimensions. Let me just note, if I'm just going to take a couple of examples from India. Because, for one thing, well, first of all, India is a pretty big country, probably going to be the biggest country in population by mid-century. But this innovation agenda, I will just say that many of us, including the President, discussed directly with Prime Minister Modi, and what I would say is the reaction reinforced the importance of this innovation agenda just as I described it. That is, an immediate recognition by the Prime Minister how success in this agenda would allow India, for example, to have this more ambitious approach in the future. But let me just give a couple of anecdotes, if you like, involving India on both the adaptation and mitigation fronts. On the importance of adaptation, there's a paper written a few years ago by my then colleague at MIT. Neither of us is at MIT anymore, but my colleague and economist, Michael Greenstone, who and some of his colleagues, who did an exquisite kind of regression analysis in terms of the impact on mortality in India and the United States of more extremely hot days, as would be expected if we don't manage our climate challenges more effectively. And big surprise, the effect on mortality of more days, 100 degrees, et cetera, in the United States was essentially zero. It's called adaptation, air conditioning. In India, it was a profound effect in terms of increased mortality. It just says, again, we need to address this technology, have it more widespread. But of course, as you all know, it's not quite so simple because, for example, if we just look at the increase in cooling without addressing the technology, let's say, of HFC replacement, that itself is going to cost us another 0.5 to 1 degree centigrade by the end of the century. So these are complex discussions. I was just involved in that, by the way, in Saudi Arabia, another country which is concerned about cooling in the future and HFCs. So anyway, so this is just an example where the innovation agenda has to work, and it has real consequences for real people who would be suffering the brunt of increased warming. So that's on the adaptation front. On the mitigation front, another an India example, which I think is terrific in terms of the importance of this innovation and cost reduction. And I'm going to come to some specifics about the cost reduction that we have been seeing through innovation in clean energy. But in India, they've just taken a remarkable step. I met with Minister Goyal, the energy minister, again in this period of the Prime Minister's visit here, and they are purchasing their last scaled-up purchase. They are purchasing over 700 million LEDs over a 3-year period. Their motivation, again, here is primarily to serve the poor, the rural and the poor, because, as you know, a little light can be a huge deal in terms of what they and families can do. That kind of driving to scale has allowed them to make that purchase at $1 per fixture. $1. That is a really short payback time. So that is capturing the benefits of innovation in terms of this cost reduction. In fact, let me just say the progress that we have been making. We will soon be posting on our website, before Paris, our annual update of something called Revolution ... now. You can find last year's on our website, of course, but very soon you'll have one more year's data added to that. From 2008 through 2014, here are the cost reductions. Land-based wind, 40% reduction in cost. Distributed photovoltaics, 50%. Utility scale photovoltaics, 60%. Batteries for mobility, these are so-called modeled costs, but that's a technicality, 70%. LEDs, 90%. These are the kind of game-changing cost reductions that not everybody is kind of caught up to mentally that really can have an enormous difference, as I said, in meeting our climate goals and at the same time addressing the needs of underserved populations globally. So that is kind of the backdrop, as I said, as we head into Paris. And I should say, for us, at least the Department of Energy, Paris actually has two phases. COP21, starting on November the 30th, is obvious, and I think it's public that the president will be there for the first couple of days of COP21. But also next week, there is, by some kind of coincidence, fundamentally, the International Energy Agency, which is also in Paris, has a biannual energy ministerial. And this year I will be the chair of that, a task that I accepted on the condition that this innovation agenda get a much more prominent role than it has in the past. And the IEA and its new director, Fatih Birol, were delighted to do that. So we're going to start, including with a pretty neat technology showcase in which we are sending over about 7 technology demonstrations, including something that our Oak Ridge laboratory did, which was to 3D print a Shelby Cobra, which is, it's also the 50th anniversary of the Shelby Cobra, and some of you in the audience clearly remember the Shelby Cobra. Others can read about it, and anyway, it's pretty neat, and it's all about a highly efficient, and I should also say it's an electric Shelby Cobra, but the idea that you can now 3D print these things, these kinds of things, is an example of the kinds of technology advances that are going to continue to allow us to drive down costs. Anyway, we're going to have a bunch of this neat stuff there to try to bring home this innovation agenda, and that will persist into COP21, which is about a week and a half after this meeting next week. Another important theme in this innovation agenda is the public-private partnership. I would recommend to you, if you haven't seen it, an interview with Bill Gates that's in the Atlantic Monthly this month, November, which kind of lays out his vision. It's not a new vision. It's something that's been discussed by leading CEOs in this country for about 6-7 years already. And the basic theme is that we need more public investment to kind of fill up the innovation pipeline more fully, especially at the earlier stages. But it also needs a lot more double bottom line investing by people like Bill Gates. There's very few people like Bill Gates, but Bill Gates and kind of Bill Gates primes who are prepared to put forward, and he has said that he will personally put forward at least $1 billion of his own funds for very patient, very high risk investments in clean energy technology as a double bottom line approach. And while I cannot say all the details, Bill has been working extremely diligently to put together a substantial international network of such double bottom line investors, and I think this will all be coming together later this year as we go to Paris. So I think it's pretty exciting. We will, I think, get some attention and put forward real solutions that can be, again, inclusive globally through this innovation and cost reduction agenda. So it's a major focus. So we'll keep pushing on that, but I know that you will as well. And I think this group, I continue to feel, obviously has kind of a unique access to a broad and concerned population with both environmental and moral imperatives. Again, I certainly will not lose sight of the need that as we address these large-scale economic, environmental, and security goals, we cannot forget the underserved in this at the same time. So this is, I think, to me, a real a driver, one of the drivers of a collaboration that we need to sustain, it's to Paris, but it's probably even more important from Paris as we actually make good on our promises. So, thank you very much for this collaboration, and I wish you the best for this meeting. But I especially wish you the best in meeting our shared goals. Thank you very much.